Good morning! Welcome back to our applique and thread art quilt project. Today, we're going to finish all the quilting for this project. This quilting will complete our borders. On the center panel, it will also let us add another level of depth to the thread painting I showed you in the last video. I've got my tea and my threads, so let's get started. I decided to work on quilting the main design of the borders first, because the chalk lines I traced in our first video were starting to rub off and I didn't want to lose them. I'm using a 12-weight rayon thread from Wonderfill called Glamour Amber. This is the same thread I used for some thread painting in the last video, and it has one metallic strand woven into it. That means you need to take extra care with it, using a silicone thread lubricant, lowering the tension, and taking your time with the stitching. I'm not trying to stick precisely to the pattern. I'm using it more as a kind of approximation, especially where the chalk is faded and harder to see. It's more important to keep the lines smooth and flowing. Working at 8 stitches per inch with my stitch regulator set to BSR1, and I set the idling speed or cruise speed down to 180, which is slower than I normally use. As you do this, you'll reach a balance of how fast you want to stitch. Too fast and you'll get off the track and maybe have more problems with a delicate thread. Too slow and you'll find your swirls and curves may get uneven. If you don't want to use a metallic thread, you could also substitute a regular heavyweight rayon of a similar color. By the time I started working on the corner blocks, I decided to change to a Superior 116 top stitch needle. I also put a thread wrap from Wonderfill on the thread cone, and that helped a lot. Bear in mind, there are times when stitching like this where you're going to want to take some stitches out and redo them. It's not an easy thread to remove, but at 8 stitches per inch, you can certainly do it if you need to. To help plan out the quilting for the central block of this project, I'd like to show you a test experiment I made a long time back. It was part of the inspiration for this quilt, and you can see that aside from the appliques, it has the same basic design. Here you have the first bird, then the second bird, and the flowers. Let's start with the bird's tails. On this one, I echoed the tail with a lot of free motion feathers, but I know a lot of people are hesitant about doing feathers off the cuff that way. I looked around and I realized that the stencil I used to lay out the designs on the background here and in the corner here can also be used to lay out the tail. As you see, you can turn this either direction and line it up with the curve of the tail feathers. Get it as close as you can, mark part of it, then turn the stencil a bit and mark a little more. You may need to mark this last little bit freehand where the tail attaches to the bird. For the other tail, you can even pull the stencil way out and around and center it on the tail and mark this whole plume of feathers if you want. In the corner, you can see I also used this part of the stencil to mark off the corner design. I also used it to fill this background area, but I probably wouldn't do that if I'm also using it around tail feathers. If you want to use the same stencil, I've added a link to it below and on my site. The next thing I'm going to do is make a test sample with some scraps left over from the main project. With this kind of stencil, you mark the lines using a quilt pounce with powdered chalk. That's useful to have, but if you don't, you could probably take your chalk pencil and mark along the lines of the stencil. Just brush the pounce over the stencil and check that you see the lines before you remove it. If you need to get more chalk flowing, you can tap it in its case and then go on to the next one. Now, let's go back to whatever machine you're using for free motion quilting and try stitching it. For the feathers, start by stitching the spine as if you were doing them freehand. Then work your way up from the small end. There are really just two movements to learn for this kind of feathering. You stitch the one feather around the curve and back to the spine. The next feather starts from the spine and curves around back to the first feather. Then you alternate back and forth. This is kind of a formal approach to feathers, and some people call it long arm feathers. As you're stitching, don't worry if you get off the track a little bit. It's more important to keep the curve smooth. If you get too intent on following the line exactly, you may find yourself wobbling back and forth to keep on track as I did here. At the end of the spine, you can retrace the spine back to the beginning and then start with the other side. I have on my Fons and Porter quilting gloves. There are a lot of quilting gloves available. I just like these because they let more air filter into your hands. Now let's use the curves I drew that match the curves of a bird's tail feather on our main quilt. I used a curved ruler to mark out two lines that closely match the male bird's tail, so you can see how we would do this freehand. This particular ruler is made by Lisa Caillet, and I highly recommend her rulers in general. They aren't a sponsor or affiliate or anything. I just like using them. They're not so big you can't use them with a regular machine. Here we'll do the feathers freehand without marking, but we'll use the same techniques for stitching, alternating patterns from one feather to the next. For a lot of the background quilting, I'll be using a 40-weight polyester thread by Superior called Magnifico with a tension setting of 2.0. You can get a similar thread in several brands. The color is a good match for the fabric I'm using. In the end, I decided to freehand the feathers around the birds' tails. I'll still use the feather pattern in a different part of the center panel. For the Q20 people, we're using the BSR1 setting on the stitch regulator with 10 stitches per inch. I've set it to 250 for the idling or cruise speed. I've saved that as program 4 because I use that combination a lot. After the row of feathers, I'm going to add an echo to extend the pattern a little more. I'm just doing this by eye, keeping the echo pretty even. I'm also going to do an echo stitch around the rest of the bird and some of the other objects. I'm not going to start with an edge stitch or a stitch in the ditch because that's part of our decorative stitching and thread painting. I've done the thread painting here already on the lighter bird, but not the darker bird. Usually I do the thread painting first, but in this case I had to wait for a shipment to arrive with the darker blue thread. Over here, you'll see I marked out the concept of some larger swirls I want to do around the lighter bird's tail to help fill some of the space. Brushing away some of the chalk, I can take a look at how the stitching actually came out and see where I might want to make some improvements. I'm doing more swirls outside the feathers I stitched around the darker bird too, to build on that pattern and fill in some of the large area of space I have over here. Now you see, we have these nice flourishes around the bird's tail feathers, and they make a great addition to the quilt. In the corner, I've marked it a pattern from the template I showed you earlier. For a pattern like this that has a lot of backtracking, the laser pointer I have set up on my Q20 helps a lot. When you get to a tight corner point, you need to stop and let it stitch a couple of extra stitches. That makes a nice sharp corner. It also helps keep the tension in the thread from pulling across the corner and warping your quilt. I actually find it easier to stitch feathers freehand than to use a stencil. However, I think they're helpful if you're not as used to them. They can also be useful when you're trying to do kind of a symmetrical pattern like this one. I think I'm going to add an echo around this pattern as well. We have some more space left around this and between here and the quilting around the bird, so maybe we'll just do some stippling to let these stand out more. Now that we have the center panel quilted, I'm going to go back and fill in the rest of the area around the borders. I'm going to use a black thread matching the fabric and focus on echoing the shapes I already established earlier. You can stitch to the edge here. It isn't going to matter if some of this eventually gets covered up by the binding. As you get closer to the edge, you can stitch along the edge between the center panel and the border to get to the parts that aren't finished yet. On the sides, you'll see that in the middle, You'll get to a point where you need to cross between one shape's echo and the next to fill in some of the space in between. With that, our quilting should be done. At this point, our project is almost complete. We're ready to wash it, block it, trim it, and add a binding. After that, there are still a couple of finishing touches I think would help enhance how it looks even more. When we get back together next time, I'll show you those, and our applique and thread art quilt will finally be complete. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you're enjoying this project, I'd be grateful if you can hit the like button too. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please post them below and I'll try and get back to you as soon as possible. Until then, have fun in your studios.